Hello, this is the latest from RT. A peace that is no peace. Could the new Cold War turn nuclear? The existence of two or three major military powers with colossal stockpiles of nuclear weapons is supposed to reduce the likelihood of Armageddon. So has it? In late 1945, three preeminent authors of several fictional dystopias, George Orwell, published a column entitled You and the Atomic Bomb. Addressing the wide readership, this classic 20th century literature suggested that the impact of the course of history of such technological innovations as nuclear weapons would be far greater than anything we had ever happened before. We may be approaching a time now when the course of world politics will either confirm Orwell's judgment or predictions or tragically disprove them. To make matters worse, even learning from past global tensions between nuclear powers is no. What the fuck? Pinky. Hold on. Look at that. A solution already. Okay. The position of the world has changed significantly over the past 30 years, and the most acute indirect conflict is taking place in the close physical proximity to Russia's main administrative and industrial centers. This is why many serious observers now have some misgivings about whether U.S. strategy, which in most general terms seeks to replace the logic of confrontation with Moscow from 1945 to 1991, is the right one. If we try to summarize Orwell's supposition, it boils down to the fact that acquisition of two or three powers of such tremendous opportunities to destroy not only each other but the whole of humanity changes the whole disposition of world history. Previously, as we know, it has always been based upon the ability of power to kick back at the existing world order, and the consequences of such revolutions became fundamental to the next. Post the atomic bomb, Orwell wrote, all the nations would have been prevented from even thinking that such a move could be successful for them. Nuclear powers can't because a world war would lead them to guaranteed destruction. And the small, medium-sized ones can't because it would relative weakness to the militaries. On the face of it, it seems to be true. By acting according to old methods, restocking the military force, none of the developing powers can now quantifiably change their position in the world. It's the axiom that it is impossible to defeat a nuclear power in a war that the only threat to it is itself. That is the inability of the political system to keep its populations in relative harmony. As Orwell writes, if as seems to be the case, it is a rare and costly object as difficult to produce as a battleship. It is likelier to be put in large scale wars with the cost of prolonging indefinitely peace that is no peace. First premise has been confirmed. Even economically powerful China does not yet appear to have the arsenals comparable to those of Russia and the US. The second, the end of major wars, needs more evidence. The accumulation of this main issue facing world politics today, however painful it may be for us, for our thoughts about our future. Orwell writes that nuclear powers are states that are unconquerable, and therefore in a permanent state of Cold War with their neighbors. Yes, that is exactly what it looks like. Since the Cold War is known to be an alternative to a hot war, few people doubt that not all practices of U.S. or Russian foreign policy are entirely satisfactory respective to their respective neighbors. Notably, in the case of the Americans, for whom controls over the for whom controls over the others is an important part in their own prosperity. As understood by the political establishment and its sponsors, in recent years we have seen many examples of the U.S. treating its European and Asian allies very harshly. Germany has lost its economic privileges in the conflict between Russia and the West. France has been reduced to the position of America's junior partner, even though it has some nuclear weapons of its own, not to mention the Asian countries of Japan and South Korea, whose entire foreign policy is determined by Washington. Often under direct pressure, none of the above countries has the power to engage its position. Cold War, in the Orwellian sense of the term, thus remains the most important feature of world politics in the nuclear age, and it is not surprising at all that the U.S., guided by its very rules, is learned over the past decades. First and foremost, its lack of responsibility for the fate of those whose hands the United States is waging its proxy war. Simply because the U.S. does not link its own security to their survival. This means that America cannot fully understand the possible reaction of an enemy to the actions of those it uses to achieve its objectives. Because proxies are not official representatives or citizens of the U.S. Washington feels it's not formally responsible for their actions. Some observers have pointed out that some of the radical movements in Syria receive support abroad, for example, Turkey. But this has had little effort on Russia's relationship with its sponsors. China wants to actively use radical Marxist movements in Southeast Asia and provided them with various forms of support. However, this didn't turn its relations with countries where such groups were active into a state of war. The USSR also supported various rebel movements operating against the US and its allies, but Washington did not see this as a reason for a bigger conflict. From the point of view of any normal state, only direct aggression by the other side against its national territory is a reason for war. Perhaps that's why the U.S. doesn't believe its actions in Ukraine could prompt direct conflict with Russia. But it remains to be seen what the extent of such logic can work now that the conflict is taking place in immediate vicinity of the capital of Russia, the capital of the Russian state, and not, for example, in distant Afghanistan, especially since NATO's policy of enlargement over the past 30 years has created a number of opportunities for the U.S. that pose challenges. After all, bloc members in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, are perceived in Washington and Moscow as nothing more than American proxies whose involvement in hostilities has little to do with the direct threat of Russia or threat that Russia and the U.S. might pose to each other. Needless to say, the potential threats and upheavals in this scenario have been based on an assumption that could entail Nor should we ignore the not fully understood link between the foreign policy positions and the great powers and the domestic stability. We can see that much of the Americans' nervousness about what is happening in the world is related to the need to continue to benefit from the overall functioning of the global politic and economic system. Not only is it difficult for the U.S. to accept change in this area because of its inertia of its thinking, but it could be dangerous until the U.S. establishment finds other effective ways of keeping the situation under control at home. Especially since the general crisis of the socioeconomic system created by the Western since the mid-70s is not going away, but only gaining momentum. Yes, generally speaking, the presence of two or three major military powers with colossal stockpiles of nuclear weapons reduces the likelihood of a war in general, in the traditional sense. But the state of peace that is no peace, promised by the classicists, is still looks like balancing act on the verge of something that would render the theoretical constructs meaningless. This article was first published by Discussion Club, translated and edited by the RT team.